Physalis painting tutorial. This tutorial has all: roundness, yellow pigments, detailing, different surface, and shine on a Physalis fruit. Line drawing is done and I will be painting in my sketchbook. Be really careful with the fruit outline. Erase it as much as possible. Yellow pigment is not forgiving and it's showing all graphite even after many layers. So even transferring line drawing, do it super lightly. Now to watercolor mixing. Indian yellow, separately manganese violet, lemon yellow, second mix Sennelier red, third Indian yellow, small amount of alizarin crimson, and perylene green, also small amount. I want to get really light and warm brown watercolor mix for the Physalis fruit leaves that we see beautiful around the fruit, and adjusting pigments, testing on a piece of paper. I found the first one, it's too yellowish. I added lemon yellow to check, maybe I need something else, removing some part of pigment mix, adding a little bit of alizarin crimson until I get this really warm and light brown watercolor mix. Perylene violet, indigo, and Indian yellow. For the stem, for the veins, some details, adjusting pigments till I get dark brown, almost black watercolor mix. Testing on a piece of paper. Now to painting. Be sure that your water is clean. With round synthetic brush, I'm applying water, taking manganese violet, small amount, and apply transparent amount of manganese violet to the shadow area of Physalis fruit. Yellow pigment is tricky because even if you apply many layers of yellow pigment, shadow area will not become dark. This is the only pigment that acts like that. If you apply red pigment with many layers, it will become darker in terms of tonal values. With the yellows, it's completely different story. And applying violet, very light watercolor pigment in shadow helps that shadow area to look darker. Now applying Indian yellow to some more visibly yellow areas and pushing towards the manganese violet. Be sure when you are pushing yellow towards the violet area that the area is completely dry. And also layer of yellow is transparent, not too saturated. We will be building layers of fruit very gradually. We don't want straight away after 1 or 2 layers to have a finished fruit. It can't be done. It will look flat, unrealistic, and more like an illustration. If we wanted to achieve realistic look of this fruit, we need to layer transparent watercolor mixes. Now, fruit is not the only subject in this composition. If that would be the only one, I need to physically sit and wait for it to dry, for the layer to get dry. Now that I have around this fruit beautiful fragile leaves of the Physalis, I can move on and paint there. While the fruit is drying, I'm painting leaves. Applying water using round synthetic brush and light brown watercolor mix, Indian yellow, alizarin crimson, perylene green, applying transparently on the whole area of this leaf. Transparently, lightly. Some areas, the back that is on the left, a little bit darker, and the lower part is also a little bit darker. Again, we will layer, we will add many layers also to these, also transparent leaves, but we will do that gradually. Everything after 1 to 2 to 3 layers is super light, super transparent. We are setting in tonal values, where are lights, where are shadows. Moving on forward slowly, gradually. Layer of root is dry, and I'm applying next layer of Indian yellow. transparently, a little bit of Sennelier red. In the shadow area, there's this really bright orangey, strong color in the reference. And we will build it gradually and slowly with lots of transparent layers. I want to erase this area from graphite because this is one of the lightest part in this composition, and I don't want to graphite lines be seen through layers at the very end. Now the layer of the first leaf is dry, and I'm applying the same watercolor mix to the darker areas of that leaf, which is on the left and the lower part. While everything is drying, I'm taking finer tip brush and apply first layer to the stem. Stem closer to the fruit is much darker, and then it gradually becomes lighter. Also, the side where is the shadow is changing because the stem is curved. The outer part of the stem shadow is on the right side, and then it goes again to the right side, only it looks like the other side. Painting only first layer for the stem transparently and with the finer tip brush. Be careful with outer parts of the stem. Don't make the stem with each new brush stroke wider and thicker. Be sure that you keep in those lines. This is really important to have stems. Even it's better to have them thinner rather than thicker. It looks more natural, more eye-appealing when you have a really nice slim stem. Especially this fruit is already off its tree or bush and it starts to dry, and when stems dry they become much smaller, thinner. Now the fruit part is dry, and I can apply next layer using round synthetic brush. I need beautiful wide brush strokes, and round synthetic brush is perfect for that. leaving light area much wider than it appears in the reference. In the reference, we can see even there are 2 spots of light area. On the right, that spot is brighter. On the left is a little bit 1 tonal value down, a little bit darker, but still they both are quite light and some shine is visible. And to make something look shiny, we need a bigger contrast, which I just applied for the left one, and then these both are divided with half tones of some yellows. That will be gradually done with layers. A little bit of Sennelier red to Indian yellow, and carefully applying to the shadow part of this fruit. Moving back to leaves, taking a little bit of dark watercolor mix of Perlin Violet, Indigo and Indian Yellow. I want to have a little bit darker area on the bottom part of this leaf. Zoom in closer reference, study that area. You can pause the video anytime and look much closer, more careful what is happening in that specific area that you are working on. Adding Indian Yellow to my watercolor mix of the darker one to make more darker brown watercolor mix. And moving on, painting slowly, carefully studying reference all the time. No matter how long I'm painting, I will be looking at the reference. And now we have a very interesting area just underneath the fruit. I'm adding the same brown watercolor mix with a little bit of darker black watercolor mix, and lots and lots of fine brush strokes using finer tip brush, painting with the very tip of the finest brush. So I can see from the reference photo that there's like a lot of fine lines. Also, each line starts at just underneath the fruit and then gradually lifts up at the end. Also, leaves are separated with the darker one, which is on the right, without any outlines, without any dark lines, separating with the shadow. adding Indian yellow to my brown watercolor mix, the more I look at the reference, I start to notice that some parts of these leaves have some yellow pigment, and I decided to add Indian yellow. I feel that I need a really warm yellow pigment here. Lemon yellow is, compared to Indian yellow, much cooler yellow pigment, so I'm going with Indian yellow. You can use cadmium yellow if you don't have Indian yellow. And I didn't notice these yellow color tones in the beginning. I thought that these leaves have only different tones of brown watercolor mix, but as usual it happens, the more you study and observe the reference you have, the more you start to notice these different things, some color transitions, different color tones, or some interesting details and textures. It all happens only when you are looking, not from the first sight, not just having a little glimpses, only when you are carefully in the work, in the study of your reference. Here I waited for layers for paper surface to be dry completely and erase some visible graphite lines, especially on the outer parts of leaves where we don't have black, dark brown vein. There are some parts on these leaves where edge is just brown, light brown. Some parts are darker lines, but some are just as they are light brown. So be careful when you will be adding veins. Don't add them everywhere. Don't outline all the leaves. There are specific areas where it is visible, and there are specific areas where there's no black lines at all. Fruit surface is dry. Applying Indian yellow to the lower part, which is in the shadow. Building those layers, making it more and more vibrant. In the reference, it looks almost like it's shining. We need to achieve the same result only with patiently adding watercolor transparent layers. Let's zoom closer and work on the stem. Working with finer tip brush, using lots of little stippling brush strokes, we see in the reference photo that it's not smoothly painted stem. We need those little dots. They will create the hairy texture, the uneven texture of the stem. And look carefully how tonal value of the shadow area is transiting from one side to another. And now I'm adding little hairs. It's almost like you are painting with one little fur of your brush. This how I'm painting with the very tip, where just one little fur, and with that one I'm applying those hairs. So they are so tiny, so small. If you don't have such a thin brush, you better don't apply these little hairs at all. Test on a different piece of paper. Can you get a really little hairs on these on the stem? If you can't get with your brush, or for some other reason, you can completely leave that out. It will be much better. If you are sure and confident that you can paint those little tiny hairs, then go for it. Using same pigments, Indian yellow, Perylene green, and alizarin crimson, I'm mixing new brown watercolor mix. Don't worry if your watercolor mix runs out, you can always pre-mix it. You know which pigments you were using. This way is one of the best way to train watercolor mix. When you use small amount of watercolor mixes, and when you run out of them, you can mix again. And if the color tone is slightly different, don't worry, you're using the same pigments and slightly different color tones. Your painting will only benefit. And I'm applying next layer for the darker area right under the fruit with fine brush strokes using finer tip brush. Working further with the left side leaf, need more layers, especially on the lower part, which is in the shadow, because it goes under and goes away from light source. There's also some yellow color tones. Adding more Indian yellow to my color palette, a little bit of Sennelier red, and applying next layer to the shadow area of the fruit. Now let's do something different. Let's start veins. I feel that layers for the leaves are enough until this point, and we can apply veins. Now, before you start applying veins, try on a separate piece of paper. If you can paint, practice a little bit, really fine lines. And those lines, if you really take a closer look at the reference, are not straight. Some lines are somewhere thicker and become thinner closer to the outer part of the leaves. In some sides, like here, there is the part where line is visible and then it's not visible at all. So it's important to really carefully, I don't know how many times I'm repeating that during the tutorial. Maybe somebody's counting and can comment me, but you need to look at the reference photo. Even that you are following my tutorial. Constantly check the area that we are working on together. Pause the video, zoom in closer, and try to see what I'm talking about. Like in this area with those veins. There are edges where it is visible, there are edges where it is partly visible, and there are edges where there's no black line at all. And to make something look realistic, natural, we need to follow guidances in the reference photo. Good reference photo is the best source of knowledge for your realistic painting. And as I'm applying secondary veins, they are even thinner than those ones which are vertical. And in some areas, those secondary veins or even third in line veins are not black, but I will be using brown watercolor mix and they are much lighter or browner. But these secondary veins are becoming thinner and more lighter. This is the contrast between thicker vertical veins, primary veins of these leaves, and then there's secondary, thinner, and even in different color tone veins. Don't rush this part. This is really part which will stand out. Fruit in this composition is standing out, but also these veins, they make this Physalis so eye-catchy. Of course, it is the first thing that we notice in the reference photo. Beautiful fruit and these interesting leaves with those veins. But we are painting already for 40 minutes and only we just started to paint these crispy veins. Don't rush this stage. Practice before on separate piece of paper. Practice your fine brush strokes. I'm almost painting with one hair on my brush. That's how thin secondary veins should be. Another thing, in the reference we see so many veins. I will not be painting all of them, but if you want, you can definitely push your patience a little bit further and start applying more veins. If you start that on one leaf, that means that you will need to finish all leaves in the same style. I'm not applying and recreating all veins that I see in the reference, but I'm keeping this to all leaves. It's not like, oh, I'm so enthusiastic right now and I will apply almost so many veins to the first leaf and then I start to lose my patience and my enthusiasm and then I start to add lesser amount of veins. No, it's not working like that. If you started to apply much more veins, then take a break and continue the same with the second leaf and the third leaf. You can start even by applying lesser amount of veins, finish all leaves. If you still feel that you can do more, go ahead and go over each leaf again. Take a break and just continue. Now that I have veins, I noted that this area is lacking shadow area. So even that veins are painted, no worries, I'm painting transparently. I can cover this area with a transparent watercolor mix and my veins will stay in place. That is the benefit of painting transparently. You can layer, not losing what is happening under 5 layers even. Next layer to the fruit. Zooming in closer, adding Indian yellow to the area there where we have a darker watercolor mix, a little bit of alizarin crimson, more Indian yellow, and a little bit of darker watercolor mix. So I have this brown watercolor mix, but which is more closer to the red side, and I noticed that veins on the sleeve, on the further part of the sleeve, which is the lightest part, are not black, but more like reddish brown. So that's where I'm applying this. And this leaf, particularly this middle leaf, is very tricky because this middle part is the further part of this composition. And we don't need super crisp details here. This will create the illusion that it's something further, something away from us, much more closer to us, which are both leaves on the right and left are closer to the viewer. So we need much more crisper details, much more darker and contrasty looking details. Next layer to fruit area, painting with Indian yellow with a little touch of Sennelier red and clean Indian yellow. The lowest part of this fruit, I see that there's this yellow almost shining there. Now we have leaf that is on the right side of the composition, and here those crispy veins look uneven and have little waves and little turns here and there, so following reference guidances. brown watercolor mix with a little bit of darker, adding a little bit of Indian yellow and Sennelier red. I'm just adding pigments that I have on my mixing palette to get brown, light brown watercolor mix. And the lower part of the sleeve needs more shadow, needs more darkness, because it's also away from light source, it's in the shadow, so we need to get these tonal values more contrasty looking to have this three-dimensional illusion on the paper surface. Here also, some veins are not black, but more browner and even more to the red side, painting with the very tip of the brush. Some veins have a little bit of shadow right underneath, and you can see that in the reference, really subtle shadow area. And in some places I'm adding that very light shadow, but this is also giving a nice, more natural and interesting look to these leaves. Let's have an overall look at the whole composition. Compare areas, leaves, fruit, stem, compare to one another, compare to the reference, where we need more contrast, where we need maybe some details, some extra lines, some extra spots. It is a time, if you paint it transparently, you have lights, you have nice shadow, you can continue. This is the moment that you can paint on and on, adding details to this beautiful painting more and more. We are painting more than 1 hour, and it is quite fast for such a realistic painting, but to get it really realistic, more hours can be put in. You can paint extra 30 minutes or extra hour and gradually make it more eye-catchy, more natural. Add some veins, add some shadows to the veins, add some little hairs, because the lower veins on the leaves have also some little hairs. Closer study reference, that is your guide, and push yourself a little bit further. I really enjoyed this tutorial and painting for you. Thank you. Hope you learned something new, and see you in next tutorial. Bye bye.